Hello, everyone. Back again. Today I'm joined by Professor Kim, Associate Professor at English at Northeastern, whose work centers critiques of colonialism, racial capitalism, and draws from critical digital studies, translation studies, critical theory, and critical race and ethnic studies. They're also co-founder of Offshoot Journal, which you can find a link in the description of this video, that fosters and cultivates an art space to facilitate transatlantic communication, art production, activism, so many different things there, and click the link if you want to find out more. And today we're discussing their new book, The Politics of Collecting, Race and the Aestheticization of Property, that can be acquired anywhere where you get books, but I definitely recommend you pursue small retailers for that who have a little bit more flexibility on what they're able to sell and distribute. So, Professor Kim, thank you for joining me today. I'm very excited
Thank
to
you so
chat
much for
about.
having me, David. I'm such a huge fan of your channel, and I send your clips to students and your podcast to students and friends and colleagues and comrades. So I'm so excited to be here. Very honored.
Well, I mean, I'm very happy to hear that. I have yet to write a book, and I'm forever in awe of people
We
who
are
are able
all
to do
waiting.
that.
We are all
We're
waiting
all waiting.
for the
Oh
book.
God, does that mean I have to be a good writer? That's rough. But I mean, this book just right off the bat, it made me interested in things I didn't really know I was interested in. Some of them included like art history and uh, also museum studies and the studies of collections and everything like that, which we're going to get into in a lot more detail. But just like off the bat, what are some of your inspirations for having written this book? Like what brought you to this topic?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, I think my interests are always kind of materialistically grounded and rooted. So I think some of it is like taking classes as an undergrad, but also just kind of like being someone who was interested in like literature and art as like a young person and the things that I was encouraged to do and think about. I think a lot of my early education was encouragement to like visit museums or encouragement to like visit the library and in undergrad and sort of throughout learning about kind of like the movements, like, you know, the art movements that are pivotal, like, and in literature, like different kinds of modernism or like the breaks of postmodernism. And as I sort of was moving through this history, something always kind of tugged at me, which is like this question of like, I'm reading a lot of theory. Some of it is like exciting, some of it is really sort of like extrapolating and kind of making meaning out of something that, you know, existed a long time ago. But I still felt like the theory was perhaps like split from like the material history, but also the historical context, right? So, like, something I always kind of return to is like my love for something like the Dadaists, like Tristan Zara, kind of being like, I always say like my first true my first true crush. You know, I was introduced to like the Dadaists as sort of like an absurd, jokestery movement, and reading more about them as I was in my 20s and like kind of later in my 30s, I realized it isn't just that they were kind of an absurd movement, and absurdity is like the aesthetic that they should be known for. They were like Zara joined like the resistance against Franco. You know, him and Aragon went and like joined the resistance. They were part of the French resistance. Like they really sort of wanted to think through an aesthetic that embodied a kind of like the transformations of the world, like the political ambitions that they had. And I often felt like my education, I don't, you know, if I were to speak with the professors who taught me then, I don't know if they would necessarily agree with this characterization that this was on purpose, but I feel like there was a way in which I was instructed about this thing called art, this thing called literature that felt kind of removed from not just like the historical context, but like the financial and sort of like the political and material context. And so I think that's why I came to the book and the research topic of the book. Like, I don't think we talk about the fact that like most members of like the Surrealists and Dadaist were like members of the French Communist Party, you know, say, or like the ways in which like T.S. Eliot campaigned for Ezra Pound to be released in an Italian jail for charges of fascism, right? And so much of like U.S. modernism really comes out of a tradition that sort of where I think there's a kind of ease in talking about the aesthetic achievements, like what does the aesthetics do, what's like the newness of the aesthetic, and not so much of the political implications or the political ambitions that I think are absolutely intertwined. And I wanted to sort of really think through like what it might mean to talk about them together. And the site of the museum and the site of like a poetry archive, I think, are two ways that we can talk about the material history, the aesthetic valence or the aesthetic permission, but also like the socio-political context kind of together.
Right. And it's like, while at some moments there are these calls to separate the artist from the art, you're calling for something, at least depending on the context as well, to actually know, to dig into the artist, to find out their attachment to struggle, to find out their attachment to these various revolutionary movements and how it might maybe find its way in the art. Maybe these things will always remain separate. I mean, I'm by no means an art critic or an art historian, uh, but like I can imagine it's both um, welcoming, but also can be tricky to invoke the life of the artist while also wanting to hold on to the possibility to analyze art in itself. Or is that always in the service of like maintaining certain relations, if I can even believe that art has value for art's sake?
Sure. Okay. So I think that the separation of the art and the artist, I understand where this call comes from. It's like a wanting of a quick moral judgment not to be the final conclusion of our discussion, right? So like like we are not five, so we don't have to be split into are you a good person, a bad person, are you a good artist or a bad artist? I think even the way that people narrate this sometimes like worry me because there's a kind of self-infantilization or like an infantilization that things have to be split that way. But I actually think that talking about the artist, at least the way that I wanted to talk about art and literature in my book, was not so much like a splitting up of like, you know, artists and writers with good politics, whatever that means, or bad politics, but more thinking about like the circulation and the ways in which certain artists seem to provide permission for a particular kind of formal experimentation or a kind of propertied understanding of like a movement. So if I take something like Marcel Duchamp, who's also like known as someone who was, you know, sometimes like associated with like movements like the Dadaist and familiar with like members of the Surrealists, like I look at him not because I'm interested in a moral judgment of him, but I look at the sort of relationship that he had with his primary patrons like Walter and Louise Arnsberg's. So if we look at like the patronage relationship, I think that there's a different way to talk about, I think there's a different way to get at the critique of merit, and there's a different engagement with theory that we can have about the kind of permission that we as a society feel like we're getting from someone like you know, Duchamp's like found object. So if we take him as like an example that I take up in the second and third chapter of the book, I look at how so the Arnsbergs, they come from kind of like they are members of an aristocratic class. So Walter Arnsberg's father owned a steel mill on the same sort of area that the Carnegie steel kind of industries operated in. So even though like someone like, you know, Henry Clay Frick's Frick collection would be considered like the home of like the European masters, and someone like Duchamp is considered like, you know, the height of like 20th century experimentation, or like the father of the found object and institutional critique, where the sort of patronage funding comes from is from the same root, which is like an extraction a fundamental kind of depletion of like the resources of a particular area for the ambitions of the robber barons, but also the US military sort of apparatus, right? So like, I think this might be a way that we can think about like Silicon Valley and tech today. So like, how is the money kind of shared? We want to make aesthetic differentiations, but how can we think about like the economic root or like the material root of some of the patronage or philanthropic projects? So Arnsberg comes from sort of that dynasty. He doesn't ever really take up a job, because why would one need a job? Him and his wife, like, they have an apartment above them. They invite Duchamp, and they become, he's a member of what's considered like the Arnsberg Salon. And then Duchamp kind of almost works as an art dealer on their behalf, like kind of brokering the art objects that the Arnsbergs are interested in. And I learned about all of this by looking at the Philadelphia Art Museum's archives, because the Philadelphia Art Museum ends up acquiring the Arnsberg collection. And they end up acquiring the Arnsberg collection because you can see in the archive that Duchamp and Walter and Louise Arnsberg worked together to try to figure out who is going to receive the donation of their collection, right? So like, if the current sort of like almost discourse of merit is like, you make really good art, whatever that means, somebody's interested, so they buy your art, and then you become part of the permanent collection. And all of that is like mystified. All of that is sort of like, there's a sort of discourse of worthiness or like unworthiness. Like, perhaps you're not a good artist and that is why you're not collected. But what happens to the narrative if it's like, do you have 20 years to work with a patron to configure the institution that is going to house the permanent collection, in which you are a primary kind of like, your objects are kind of primary to that collection. So something that the Philadelphia Art Museum offers, which is also demonstrated in archival correspondence, is like 20 years of uninterrupted display of the collection. So the Metropolitan Museum offers, I want to say like less than 10 years. The School of the Art Institute kind of offers, or the Art Institute of Chicago also at some point is interested. The Walker Art Museum, Walter Arnsberg says they're interested, but Duchamp in the letters is like, I don't know anyone who's going to go there. Like, we need a better institution. Like, they're very, it is not, there's like almost no romance in these conversations. It's very like, it's what I would expect from people who are thinking through like real estate, actually. Like, that Philadelphia Art Museum, like, they are offered like good rooms with high ceilings in a spot that like makes sense. And this information is also in the archives because at some point the Arnsbergs were audited. So they had to make an account of all of the finances that were deployed in the pursuit of their collection, but also the sort of the ways in which their collections were managed. So this is not a judgment to say that this relationship shouldn't have happened, right? Like, I think that like this is not, I am not interested in prescriptions, actually. I'm interested in how the patronage relationship becomes almost like under theorized and the aesthetic achievements over theorized. Because I think that you could make an argument that says that that could actually read the found object entirely differently, but we don't really have other readings of the found object for the like listeners who are not like sort of aware. Like, there's so many art history books that have really been written about like Duchamp, the person who like brings the found object to like audiences. This is like the height of like, liberation. That's sometimes like the actual language that's used. Like, I cite an artist in the book that says like he freed artists. Like, this is like freedom for artists, right? And like part of the freedom that's attached is like, it's attached to this like piece called like The Fountain, where the story goes, Duchamp like submits a urinal to the Society of Independent Artists and calls it The Fountain. And he says like, an anonymous artist submits it and says that like, they didn't make it, but it's their art, and like they should accept it, and then it's rejected, and then there's a review that's written about the piece in a magazine called The Blind Man, which is also a magazine that Walter and the Arnsbergs funded. So that is important, I think. The two of them kind of worked on this. They were like, oh, it's scandalous that you rejected it, so we're going to write about it. And then this pushes, this is the current kind of like theory around it, like this pushes for the art object not to be so tied to the hand of the artist. Like, it's like pushing the idea that like something, it's called found object because, everyday objects are full of artistic possibility, or like the artist's labor, the artist's achievement is not like the hand, it's like the ways in which they can remake the world through their vision, even if it's not by hand. That is the current sort of like theorization around like the importance of the fountain, the importance of like many of the sort of found object art, found object kind of gestures that are made. Tell me if I am,
No,
tell me
that's
if,
great.
okay.
This is great. No, that
Like,
was a great introduction because my
yeah,
follow-up is to say, like, it provides the illusion, like when you describe the fountain and when you describe found art, the phenomenon of found art and its contribution to the field of art is that anybody can be an artist.
yes,
And what you're saying is like, actually, no, that's an illusion because you have someone like Duchamp who's being taken up by the Arnsbergs to do this kind of work. Somebody also who's enjoying a number of other privileges. And it makes me wonder because, you were describing the ways in which it takes a certain amount of wealth to be able to do things like develop collections, take in artists. And this really speaks to the title of your book, like the politics of collecting. But you also mentioned the way in which like the Philadelphia Art Museum contributes to this. And although they might not have the same kind of immediate profit incentive, we'll dig into that in more detail, but like they are also participating in what you're calling the politics of collecting. If you're willing to elaborate on that, what you mean by the term, what it looks like how it does evil.
yeah. So cut me off at any time so that I can elaborate on a particular point. But part of what I wanted to, there are two things that I wanted to get to, and then I'll continue to answer your question, which is a urinal in 1917, New York City. So this is also the thing that I think is eclipsed in the theorization of the fountain, which is it takes place in 1917, New York City. So I'm not talking about biography of the artist. I'm saying if we're just looking at like the object, what is 1917 New York City? Like, and what is a urinal in 1917 New York City? So if you read something like Noah Purfoy's White Colored, which is an outdoor sculptural found object piece as well, that takes a fountain and a urinal and sort of flips it, and it's titled White Colored because that is actually how you can reread something like fountain, which is an object that would have been a signifier of segregation in New York City, right? So like, so perhaps like it's not an accidental everyday object. It is actually it's speaking to the ways in which the very foundations of property are connected to a kind of aesthetics and fundamentally about like an exclusionary site all at the same time, right? So it's like it's not, I don't think it's a mistake that like this object of kind of glaring segregation becomes this like marker of like liberation for so many and theorized this way and then under theorized, right? So like whenever you see like pictures of it, it's just kind of like decontextualized white space, like fountain, it might say 1917, but it doesn't really say like if you did find it in New York, what does it mean to find it in New York? Later in the 40s, people have written about how like Duchamp like commissioned like Italian artisans to reproduce the urinal so that it can eventually be sold. So like that's like a separate sort of conversation that we could also have that perhaps needs to be theorized with it. But like I want to sort of push using sort of the patronage records, this history of collecting, the ways in which collecting, patronage, and property kind of function together to look at the ways in which perhaps the permission that's really provided in something like the found object is an evasion of labor and an elevation of a particular kind of managerial class or the managerial pursuit, which was also happening at the time. So like 20th century New York City is also, or like 20th century United States, East Coast is also where we have something like Frederick Taylor's scientific management being like quote unquote experimented upon, and like the publication of shop management. And scientific management, for those who are unfamiliar, it's like a precursor to what becomes known as Fordism, right? So like the division of labor. And in Taylor's case, he experimented on workers in a de-unionized steel factory to try to get workers to perform what he said was handwork. And then he tried to retrain foremen to do what he called mind work, right? And like there are records where Taylor is like, the foreman wants to kind of do things with the workers, and like it's like requiring something different to really convince the foreman that he should be removed of this thing called handwork. There's a really kind of important book called Labor and Monopoly Capital by Harry Braverman. He himself was someone who worked in the steel mills, and then, I mean, in the tradition of something like Gramsci's like organic intellectual, like he writes a book sort of really thinking about like, what does it mean to sort of de-skill workers? That's like the word that he uses. It's not like divisions of labor. It's like taking workers who used to know how to do something and then de-skilling them, right? For the purposes of what Frederick Taylor calls central planning, right? So he wants management to be able to have the knowledge of production, and he wants to de-skill workers as part of Braverman's critique. So I think the best way to sort of explain this is if someone buys an iPhone product, oftentimes it says designed in California, made in China. So like that is like the such a perfect distillation of like the elevation of this thing called mind work, which is supposed to be separated from this thing called handwork. And the division is that the design, I mean, I think that maybe this could come off as reductive, but part of it is like, design is like aesthetic. It's aesthetics. It's like, it's part of the sort of creative managerial kind of elevation. So to know the names of like CEOs who make certain decisions, that's kind of considered like a feat. Like you should know who's making the decisions, but the person who's making the decision is not the person who's putting things together. The people who are putting things together, like we often describe them as like unskilled laborers, or like a version of sort of a laboring class that's unskilled. And Braverman interjects and says, no, the workers have been de-skilled. It's never an unskilled worker. It's that they've been de-skilled. And I'm sort of trying to understand like the early 20th century and the kinds of labor divisions that were occurring. Is this also something that you can see in the fountain? And you can see in the fountain because it is reflective of the very pursuits of a very particular kind of patronage class. It's affirmative of the ways that they've lived.
Right. And even in the name, like you have found art, implies as though there are these objects out there that are to be discovered, and that's the artistic practice. And so when Marcel Duchamp is doing this kind of work and finding these things, he's employing essentially the mind in a kind of scientific managerial way to be like, these are the right pieces of art. And in doing so, with something like the fountain, I mean, you discussed how strange it would be to ignore the histories of segregation and like the significance of a toilet in those ways. But additionally, how come this isn't recognized as a work of art when a plumber installs the toilet?
Exactly.
And this is
Yeah. Yeah, I think that
please.
it's so perfectly put, because I think that that is the advertisement. Like here, the found object is really important because it liberates the artist, and now everyone can sort of become an artist. Is such a ruse, because in 1917 New York, like we have segregation. There was segregation all throughout the U.S. You have like wars happening all over like the world, but like anti-colonial kind of movements that are happening for like liberation by like a colonized group of people, whether it's like different regions of like Southeast Asia or like different things that are happening kind of in Europe. So the word human and who is considered like a propertied, recognized person in the world is contested in 1917 and today. So like I think someone like Lisa Lowe's Intimacies of Four Continents, where she really takes you through like how did the word human come to be, like who is considered human. I think like that would be a really important kind of beginning place to start before we even get to who gets to become the artist. Because if it is true that like this liberates all of us to become artists, then is art, the education, democratized? How does, or is it that like the formal imperatives and the propertied ventures of like a already recognized propertied class expands, like the instruments and the materials are actually extended for a very small group of people, and actually and limited actually for everyone else. So it's, I think like the idea of like everyone is an artist is actually like a really beautiful and powerful idea, but I don't think that that's what happens in the found object, especially the 1917 found object. I think even to this day, it has this tenuous relationship to labor, because I really wonder like if perhaps because of the way we've been taught to read it, if there's an under-analysis of material history and labor history. It's like almost like you're not supposed to think about it. You're supposed to think about the design, the idea, and I don't think that that's an accident. And simultaneously, I think the found object is something, it's a form that is most appropriate for those who are already recognized as being able to own property then and today. Yeah.
Totally. And I mean, at the beginning of your book, you discuss the ways in which people were really responding strongly to cuts to art funding, cuts to museum funding, like the Getty and everything else like this. And they were guided by a belief that there's something fundamentally emancipatory and opening about art. And in doing so, what they effectively have done have concealed those other relations, those other kind of material conditions that make art possible. Like how, for example, the Getty, which is in Los Angeles, is found on Tongva land. And that's
Mhm.
not part of their consideration here, or how the very existence of the Getty relies upon this philanthropic, uh, like like really dumping of money into this without questioning where that money came from. It relies upon the labor that's been effectively exploited to acquire that wealth, then to actually produce this space that can be a site for collecting. But that gets all concealed because we just believe of art to be this thing that's good in itself, that's supposed to open us up to possibility, to the good old liberal values, but is really effective at concealing these other relations.
Yeah, I think the Getty is such a good example of this. I mean, and I can talk about the Getty and then something I talk about at the end with regards to SF MoMA. I do think that like the museums have really sequestered, like it's an institution that says like this is where you go to look at art. This is where you go to like learn about art. And I think I really question this narrative, and I think it's very clear you're sort of like encouraging that kind of questioning. But the Getty in particular, J. Paul Getty, his will mandates that it's 19th century Western European art. So it's not an accident what you see there, right? Like it's the richest museum in the world, and it's according to his vision, like the museum will collect 19th century Western European art. If you cut arts funding throughout LA, which has happened, and then the Getty offers a free bus for your school to come visit the Getty to learn about art, what is the introduction? What is the sort of ideological capture that's happening? SF MoMA, Don Fisher, the former CEO of Gap, donated his collection to SF MoMA, and the restriction that he put into the donation was that 60% of 60% of MoMA has to be, as if MoMA has to be from his collection for 100 years. So that is not a short amount of time, right? And I heard that there's something else happening at the Art Institute of Chicago where there was a donation for 50 years. So this is to say, like, if it is true that you go into these spaces to learn about art, what kind of art? How did that art come to be? What is the financial history of why that collection? I think it has to be part of the story, because otherwise it makes it, I think the undercurrent of the story without that information is that it's because of merit. It's because this is the best art, like this is the most important art, and that's why it was collected. And that's not why collections by the institution happens through the best. It's because of financial relationships, colonial history, and all the things that I think you invoked at the beginning of the Getty, yeah,
Totally.
reference.
And I often think about this, whether it's the Getty or anywhere else, where within the museum they have their sections. And the way in which they're willing to organize the distribution of art, I find very fascinating, where they'll have like, here's Egypt, then here's China. How are they, and again, this is me not knowing anything about this, but like, how are these decisions made of what gets to stand in for the art of a place like China? You know, China has however many provinces that have a larger population than Canada, like 15 I mean, there's like, it's the fourth largest country on earth with size-wise. Like, how can we possibly claim to have a section in a museum that's like Chinese art in any way that actually captures that? Because the next thing is that if there's a museum place, that museum has to speak to the people who are likely to be there. And the art that they see has to be intelligible to them as speaking through that culture. But if you have a people that are deeply embedded within an imperial setting that is depends upon white supremacy, how much of their impression of that place and the curation of that space is less meant to actually describe how these people view art in them for themselves, and how much of it is to sell, like you said, this caricature of a place. And I find that like museums are just a fantastic way to understand like colonial relations, to understand intercontinental racism, like so many different things like that that I find really on display in museums and the organization of art.
Absolutely. I think I was at a conference kind of sponsored by the Research Center for Material Culture in the Netherlands, and the director of the museum or the center, Wayne Modis, described some of the differences between the ethnographic museum and the contemporary art museum that I really agreed with. But like, I think one of the main things that you're saying that I think is a consistency is that the art museum often doesn't have to describe the labor history or the sort of, it's not divided into like nation states for the most part, like unless it's like, you know, encyclopedic museum or something, versus an ethnographic museum or encyclopedic museum often says like, here's Egypt, and then the tombstone, like the wall plaque, is often a description of like how something was made, you know, who was made. The artist is never supposed to be cited, because that's really not, I think implicitly it's like telling you like this is the communal collective or the tradition of a place, you know, whatever that might mean. But the individual artist is not the invocation. And I think in the art museum, the individual artist is the invocation. And I think that that already sets up some of the things that I'm really interested in when it comes to the development of the art museum in the US, like if we're tracing something like the personal collection that becomes the museum through the Frick collection, or like the private collections, or the ways in which personal collections become part of, you know, permanent collections of museums. I think like so much of that kind of like history of like authorship, property, is very much part of the ways in which the museum functions. But that's the part that I would like more conversation on, and I would like that to be kind of with the conversations of like, what is the art doing? Like, what is it like, you know, I don't know, like that's the part that I think is like, would actually help the conversation be expanded, rather than this in this kind of circular, ahistorical, non-materialist kind of way.
Sure. And but to continue the like to make a non-materialist kind of broad general point, like it is interesting the way in which if you have the organization of different cultural uh, art spaces within a museum, like you said, whenever that is done, you don't see a highlighting of the artist. Instead, this art is meant to just kind of have um, kind of anonymously ushered from an entire people and then stands in
Yeah.
for them. But in the West, there's this obsession with no, there's that individual artist that stands above everything and is able to offer something that's decidedly unique because it's like in the West, we're able to celebrate uniqueness and good old liberal values and the individual, whereas those other people over there, they're too stuck in their traditions. They don't know how to welcome like newness. They can only recycle the same over and over and over again. But
Yeah.
within that kind of racist caricature and presentation of the quote unquote other, what we see is concealed the kind of traditional relations that make even that individual within the Western context able to do their work, like how you describe Marcel Duchamp, like and how he relied upon the Arnsbergs. And we haven't talked about it yet. Maybe in a few minutes we can talk about the history of like union busting and the homestead strike and stuff, which you talk about a little bit. But these are the kinds of like traditional relations within this context that really determine who can even be an artist, who can participate in the politics of collecting and curation and everything like this.
Yeah, I really like the way that you framed that, and like this way, it's less that like I think like someone like Raymond Williams, you know, lifelong hero, and someone who I think like is most pivotal in this discussion, which is that like it's less about like the individual pursuits of the artist and the individual sort of imagination of the artist, and more like a kind of collective and societal feeling, a collective and societal sort of like ambition. And I think you can also see that in like the ways in which like what is it about the found object that really kind of speaks to not just the patrons, but a particular kind of collecting imperative or a kind of 20th century property understanding of the world. And this is a way to sort of de-emphasize a moral judgment of a person or like a merit reading of an artist and think about like, okay, like the ways in which maybe there is an instrumentalization of this kind of an artist that like is under theorized, which I think is often the case. Like, are there things that are being offered and then being taken up in a different kind of way?
Yeah, completely. Yeah, I just think it's super interesting and especially with like the found art phenomenon. And I think that and this is a totally uninformed opinion, but
Yes.
the other thing that I
Okay.
find really interesting about it is the way in which it offers the objects of this, what I'll just call a culture of our society, as being worthy of this kind of like within them is found the possibility of like self-realization and almost through that a kind of like transcendence through the value we find in them. And we see a similar thing kind of playing out today on like on YouTube and other platforms of people doing like taste testing different banal restaurants and stuff and like with that they're able to attribute certain words and everything to it to be able to offer uniqueness to these things as like various fast food chains being like avenues through which to demonstrate who we are as a people, which is a very cultural thing going on at the same time, but it's one that's being like really concealed under just like personal individual opinion. And
Yeah.
when you see, and then you see the analytics, and it's like turns out there's millions of people tuning into these like reviews on YouTube or whatever other platform, and it's like, wait a second, like, is this really about like an individual realization and the welcoming, the blossoming of like enlightenment liberal values in terms of like myself, or is this just a recycled repetition concealed under this, emphasis of the self or individual
Yes.
taste, which is
Yes.
just more of what we've been saying, but it's,
Yeah.
I don't know why I drew that
No,
unique
but
connection.
you put it best, I think. And that I think that that takes us to like a kind of contemporary continuum, like a kind of back and forth of like how might an algorithm or how might like the strictures of social media reflect a kind of patronage, like what used to be like a system of patronage. Like people say like, oh, there's no more patrons anymore, but like, like Facebook did have an artist in residence. And I think that there's a way in which you can really read the people who entered as the artist in residence for Facebook as perhaps providing an argument that's really lucrative for Facebook, and then also like the ways in which like YouTube and the algorithm of YouTube also functions as you're saying to create like an individual the most distinctive individual. Like how to be the most distinctive individual really seems to be at like the horizon of all of the like the videos where it's like, how do you
Well, it's in
become
the
a role
name. I
model?
mean,
Yeah.
YouTube. Like it's about
Yeah.
them, it's about giving the self. Like, and it's just the platform where you can be yourself, as though there
Yeah.
isn't this careful curation going on at the level of the algorithm and what you get to see. You can go any number of directions, like the alt-right pipeline, what kind of stuff,
Yeah.
how does it contribute to the, various different problems we find in our world, that I think is an extension of this, like, what you described earlier in Taylorism and this kind of scientific management of people and their attention and consumptive habits and working habits, we see attain a new kind of like efficiency within a media sphere that is just continuing these older legacies of, stifling and concealing like actual material working relations that keep these things afloat. While emphasizing, all the possibility offered by these platforms, by museums, by art consumption, etc. And
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. And I also think returning to the sort of Taylorism argument, a lot of anthropologists, historians have sort of argued there's never really been, like scientific management, first of all, is not a science. It's like it's one of those things that has the word science attached to it, but it's not a science. The workers basically refused all of his experiments, right? Like, so he was hired in this mill. He got into Harvard. Frederick Taylor got into Harvard, but then he rejected to work at his like father's friend's factory to sort of implement like this thing that he thought would work, which is like this redivision of labor. Also, Caitlin Rosenthal's Accounting for Slavery, like paints the history in which like you can trace how Frederick Taylor admired the slave plantation. Like he thought that it was the most efficient site of management and wanted to model the factory floor off of what he thought was the most efficient site, which is the slave plantation. So when Sylvia Wynter in Plot and Plantation says, wherever you go in capitalism, like chattel slavery is the plot, like I think it's like very, very, like it's so true. And simultaneously, this doesn't mean that like, all workers are like we should like take up slavery as a metaphor and like, dematerialize the history of sort of chattel slavery and like use the language and like appropriate the language. But you can sort of see the ways in which the person who had the ambitions to make the factory more efficient, like that's what he looked to, that's what he was sort of trying to configure, is a way in which like the body and the mind division in Frederick Taylor's sort of understanding was most clean. So that's what he was trying to reconfigure. The workers refused all of the experiments. So there wasn't a single experiment that like was quote unquote successful, whatever that means. So in this way, historians were like, there's really never really been a scientific management. It's always been kind of a failure. It's never really worked out. And nevertheless, like, I think up until the last time I checked, like, I want to say like very recently, like every once in a while, you'll see that like Frederick Taylor will get like another award from like a management school, or like, he's a really important signifier. He's an important signifier in that like he has become like very like the father of a kind of like efficiency model, managerial kind of way of reorganization, like something like central planning. Like I've seen even like the most fascinating and like intelligent kind of like writers and speakers like talk about like central planning. Like, what does that mean? Like, you know, so how do we sort of trace like what it means for some people to do the thinking in one place and other people to do the labor elsewhere? Like, where does that come from? And then I'm now going, I feel like I went on like 7 tangents today, but something that's really important to think about with Taylor and then where you get to Fordism, and I think more people are familiar with Fordism, which is, you know, like the sort of factory model like of that's like set up for like the automobiles and so forth. But Taylor is really important to talk to thinking about the phenomena of de-skilling, which has come up again. So when people talk about like something like artificial intelligence, which is not real, but like, you know, really made real through like discourse and advertising, I have been really, I taught, I've been teaching this class called Race and AI, since like 2017 or something. And it really was like a race and technology or like thinking about colonialism and technology class. But there's almost no way to think about like technological developments without thinking about race, without thinking about gender. And I've really sort of asked my students if something like the, you know, large language model in offering to read for you or summarize for you is a project of intellectual de-skilling. It's a unmasked intellectual de-skilling that's sold to you as a model of efficiency. But, you know, we know like that, like how we read something is it's a political position. Like, what is a feminist reading? What is my like materialist insistence? Like, these are like methods of reading. So like, there's nothing I think more political than a summary of an article. Like, what is the summary of an article, and why? Like the ways in which like the de-skilling process is aestheticized it was a deep concern of mine while reading the or while writing the book, which is like, how does de-skilling become aestheticized in like the early 20th century through like the collections that become presented, and then how might we be living through part of that contemporary kind of presence?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, at the beginning, you introduced the idea of de-skilling as being like an important element to all of this, and it's really like baked into to capitalist logic, because as people become de-skilled and are unable to do things themselves, unable to provide for themselves, they become more dependent upon wage labor and then buying things that they need at other places that are made possible through wage labor. And you see the steady like process of like, you know, de-skilling, as you say, happening in this more ephemeral technological realm where people are like unable to think. But I think that there's also like a trap here. And the trap is that in the face of this, some people might be like, oh, well, that we have to go back to, you know, the way it was, you know, and how people learn. Like, and I see this a lot. Like, people just need to like start reading again. And I'm like, reading what? Like, if you look at the history of like basic education within the United States, like what was that history really? It's just like reading about various different white guys from one after the other. It's not Black history. It's not the history of Hispanic people in the US. And in that, we already see a kind of before AI in its like capacity to summarize, and like the questions is like, how will it summarize this text? That was happening for a long time. And
Exactly.
it's like with like AI, I think we see a rendering more efficient of these same processes, but it's one that can often serve a very strategic function, especially to the like boomer pilled people. It's like, oh, well, the technology is the problem. When it's like, no, no,
Mm.
no, this is just the newest like manifestation of this broader historical trend from like capitalist de-skilling to white supremacist education and so on. Like all these things play a part in this historical trend. And I mean, just my own ramblings on it.
Yeah, no, 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 that's so well put because I mean, I should also be very clear that there's Braverman in making the critiques of scientific management. He says very clearly, like, there's no past to go back to. This is not a like the critique of de-skilling is not about like, oh, capitalism was better before. Like there's nothing to go back to. You know, he makes that very, very clear. He's not like, you know, the workers were happier in that form of exploitation. But he's really thinking about like, you know, in the like a fundamental absence of of autonomy as being like naturalized, and in all senses of labor autonomy being kind of normalized and naturalized as like within the Taylorist sort of processes. I also think like the inevitable kind of discourse is fascinating to me. Like, you know, you're like saying, you know, the sort of boomer impulse of like, it's social media, it's, you know, which these are things that like were created by a generation specifically for young people to be like, you know, it's like it wasn't created by the young people. So it really like bothers me when like the blame is put on the young, when I'm like, but like the generations before used all of their intellectual power to like create the very thing that is now like, it's like very much like you created a poison if you think it's a poison, and now here we are. But I guess like something that I want to talk about that I think you reference is like I look through like philanthropic history. So like you know, that's like looking to Andrew Carnegie, looking at like the Frick collection, and something that I trace is like by 1900, the Carnegie Steel company didn't recognize a single union, and this is because they violently destroyed all of the unions by doing things like calling in private militia, open firing on striking workers. And there's no romanticization of like union history either, because they, you know, there's a lot of kind of complications of like unions at the time, at least in the Homestead strike. The workers that were brought in that were non-union were Black workers, because, you know, Black workers were not allowed to be part of the union. And so like I think that the ways in which like the racialized history and the anti-Black history of kind of union organizing in the US is something to like always kind of be aware of, so that like we're not glorifying union culture or union history. But that we can say that and simultaneously also talk about the fact that like Carnegie and Frick, they were making a profit of like something like 4 million a year, adjusted for inflation, that's something like $110 million. And they still wanted to break the unions. So it's only really post the breaking of unions that they'd start on the philanthropic projects that they're known for today. So it is absolutely the loss of worker, any semblance of kind of worker organizing, right? So some of the things that broke down were things like 8-hour workdays. So workers were then set to work like 12 to 18-hour shifts, and the steel industries were some of the most fortified kind of like, or had the sort of heaviest steel presence or union presence. So breaking the industries there effectively kind of led to a further de-unionization until the Wagner Act in particular. So the workers were working like 12 to 18-hour shifts. All of the wages started fluctuating, because before the wages were pegged to like the price of steel, but also there was like a threshold, so it wouldn't go lower. And I'm mentioning all of this because something that Carnegie is known for is he's like known as like the father of libraries. He did not build 2,611 libraries, but he's credited for building them. The workers built them, and I think that that naming is important. That like even if he paid people for the libraries to be built, it's like if we're really thinking through the history of expropriation and the ways in which him and the other robber barons were able to expropriate so that only they had the money and no one else had the money, it's kind of like another sort of way in which we can rethink that history. So part of why I'm bringing this up is because someone like Paul Cruz comments that the workers noticed that your town is only offered a library after the union is broken. So the union would be broken, then you would be gifted a library. And something like over 200 communities turned it down. And some of the workers said things like, I work 12 to 18-hour shifts. Like, what is a library for me? But if that wasn't bad enough, he also would give these speeches, like, you know, when the library would be unveiled, that would say things like, you know, you should have useful knowledge. Like this is a library full of useful knowledge. And then he would disparage like the reading of Shakespeare, the reading of Ulysses, the learning of like native languages is even invoked. He's like, we don't like, why does anyone need to learn like Greek and Latin? Like you should learn like stenography. So even over 100 years ago, we're having like the same discussion where like someone is saying, only utilitarian, only useful. Your life is just about use. Like only learn things that make you a worker. And he himself, like at some point in one of these speeches, he says like the machines, it will be inevitable. They'll take over all the workers. He's like, I don't. It's not an idea I like, but I'm just saying it's inevitable. And like reading this and like reading him speak about this in like 1897 or like some year like that, I just couldn't help but like feeling like how long have they been repeating the same story that like this is all inevitable, which is like the inevitable kind of story of like, Marcuse says like the machine is just ghost labor. It contains all the things that a laborer used to do, but like now it's called a machine. And so, yeah, like you could sort of make an argument that like if Greek and Latin are not useful for workers to know, I mean, he was writing novels at the time, he was trying to, but like the workers, like they should only have useful knowledge. So this like demarcation of what he can have and what the workers can have, like that's one thing to really consider. But the emphasis of like you could only like have knowledge on the work that you're going to do. I mean, like something like the technology and the use of some, like stenography is not really useful. So like if he's using like use and not use, it's like, what does it mean to train a group of workers into the thing that's always going to be lost because of the very function that it serves, right? So it's like, I think like the absence of autonomy, it's not labor, the absence of labor autonomy, it's always that the ways in which fundamentally all forms of autonomy are at stake because that is like what's being threatened to be taken away. Like not only can you like not have like an 8-hour workday, you can also like not go to a library full of books that you might want to read because this is a library that I've gifted and also it contains what I think is useful to you. So yeah, I'm only saying this because I find that kind of utilitarian kind of pragmatic approach to be actually very much in line with like the robber baron insistence that like the workers have something that they should learn and a paternalistic kind of overview that says, and I know what you need. It's me, like the head manager.
Yeah, because otherwise you'd be like totally directionless. But this is like one of the many ways in which capitalism really welcomes its own undoing. Because like take the phenomenon of machinery, which is the really taking to the climax, like the managerial logic of reducing people to robots and while getting rid of people, rendering people obsolete. But like the problem that will present these capitalists is that then they'll have no one to buy their products. And Marx is like very clear about this, that capitalism is only able to function because of its capacity to exploit living labor. Living labor is that which can be exploited like in the dynamic way that's necessary to adapt to capitalism's ostensible dynamism. And it's what is able to keep everything moving in a way that can welcome eventually its own demise. And so these calls for utilitarianism, which I think are very much there, and we're seeing it play out in those spaces where it's supposed to not play out, like at universities, where many different universities and colleges across North America are like, administrators are sitting down and saying, these libraries are great, but wouldn't it be better if there was like a Starbucks here? And it's like this is a really haunting element of what we knew these spaces to once represent and to see their steady capture by these other interests, which isn't to say that they've ever had like a fully detached relationship. Of course, the history of education, the history of museums has always been bound up with these other relations, but even they are becoming obstacles to the progression of just pure exploitation. And I mean, this goes all the way back, and I think that by situating it within the Homestead strike that you mentioned, but also, the history of union busting and these ideas about from the late 19th century about what machines will do, we're just seeing how this is all on this trajectory, and hence the importance of this kind of materialist analysis and these interests, and to understand what will come of it. And I think that it's very much a haunting prospect, and one that's um, it's good that we're able to at least identify it in part what's going on, but it does feel like a monumental task to undo it, to challenge it, to oppose it. Like, I know that maybe putting you on the spot for giving us answers isn't the best, but we're still like, this is something we must confront and deal with. And I don't know what those conversations are like, but they should be happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that Offshoot just put out a zine called No Good Oligarchs because we've all been sort of noticing a kind of almost nostalgia. And nostalgia is always, I think, coded as a kind of white nostalgia for a past that didn't exist, but perhaps a past to return to that many cannot return to, of like, the Rockefeller built this, Carnegie built that, and like the current billionaires seem uninterested in building. So, there seems to be this kind of like I would say that it's like a fundamental misanalysis of the robber baron era to say that like they built it because they felt like wealth means that you're a benefactor, or you have to be a benefactor. Like, some people have used the term like noblesse oblige to sort of describe this. That is the sort of, but that was the PR project actually. Like, that was the PR project of the robber baron kind of group. It was to say like, the legacy of us will be like the buildings, and not like a fundamental erosion of union culture, or like, scientists are now sort of like thinking through the ways in which coal mining completely depletes the topsoil, makes like farming impossible on that particular land for like 1,000 years, like contributes to like all of the sort of environmental catastrophe. So like, instead of really thinking through like what was the cost, there seems to be almost like, why will the current oligarchs not give us like buildings or something? Like, when we have billionaires today because we had billionaires then, right? So like the billionaires of the past are connected to the billionaires of the present. And the historian Chris Manjapra, he, says like, you can only have a different kind of future if you have a different relationship to the past. Like this is, so like learning about the past is about like deep, deep care for the present, and not like the past that like, I think is the version that I think some people are very quick to sort of turn to, which you mentioned, which is like the past that like is full of like less exploitation or like less harm. It could be that like perhaps today some of the exploitation and harm, we can see the continuum, like almost an exactness of language. I can assure you, like if you read through the Gospel of Wealth book by Carnegie, or like any of the speeches, it's mind-boggling how similar the language is actually. Like it's mind-boggling how the rhetoric and the logic and the rationalist argument seems verbatim the same. And so the question is like how to sort of rupture some of the continuums in place, rather than saying, the past is there, the present is here, and the future is there. I'm not really sure we can move into a different kind of future unless there's a sort of, as Chris invokes, like a different way to sort of engage with the past history.
Totally. And one of the things as well, even toward the end of your book, you mention and discuss is the way in which art is used as a site for protest, not just like against art and the organization of art, but also as a way to call attention to other things, and how, while extremely well intentioned, and of course the urgency around these actions cannot be ignored and they should be taken very seriously. It's interesting the way in which protest against art is often then just uh, sent over to, or it extends then to just more wage laborers having to then deal with this issue, or to clean it up, or to be the ones to remedy this. And even then, to invoke Marcuse, like our avenues for political resistance, for maybe historical rethinking of the way we understand the world, can so often fall into the same traps that we see ourselves being victim to, and we see this world falling prey to. And it both causes like a kind of, in me, like an interest in what to do next, but also the fear of a certain kind of nihilism where it's like, oh well, what can be done without it just simply reinscribing the same kind of histories, the same kind of oppressions, which is part of the task, is to open up the conversation first, and to have to identify the issue, and then brainstorm what the various strategies are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that reinscription, it's always sort of, it's so important to point out, like what does it mean like to sort of go into a museum thinking that like, or like sort of, I think first like the idea that the museum is where like you can learn about art, like that narrative has to be disrupted, right? Like aesthetics, the expansion of aesthetic frameworks, I think is going to be like a materialist political project. But some of the things I invoke at the very end, it's you know, artists who would like take up protests, like anti-Vietnam War protest, by like going into a museum and like dumping the paint on the ground. And this is written about in the book Art Workers. And then like the artist not necessarily wanting to speak to the maintenance and janitorial staff who came in and asked questions, and wanting to speak with museum management, and the very sort of like trick, like the ways in which perhaps like the artist already identifies as a manager, and then speaks to other managers, might be like a way to sort of provoke that kind of reading. Like it's not like the artist comes into the space and like protests, that like protest is actually like right now we're living in a time and era where like apparently you have to like apply for a protest permit, which is I think like it should, like it's like what does that mean, like the like it's such a like a what a bizarre like oxymoron to be like apply for a protest permit. Or like I know like activists all around the world have been like disciplined, fined, punished, incarcerated for like protesting on the streets without like a protest permit, right? So like all the ways in which like so much of the capture is administrative, bureaucratic, and like part of the sort of terrain in which one is asked to enter into. So, but I would say like, I don't know, like whenever I sort of look at the history, like I don't feel nihilistic. I feel very encouraged. Like I've been reading, right before we started recording, I've been reading like the writings of like Hayati, who was a member of the Situationists and then joined the PLO, and sort of like thinking about like the history of different members of the Surrealists who kind of joined different, militant action groups, and without kind of romanticizing like that kind of action, I think that like there's a way in which perhaps we're all circling around like the same like four dominant narratives, and how to sort of like continue to agitate the framing, like the debate framing of like this versus that, is something that I'm always really thinking about. I'm also like thinking about the ways in which like what was so pivotal to kind of the writing of the book were conversations I had with like young artists and younger writers who wanted to sort of, they themselves become artists and become writers, and all of the various like menial jobs they would be asked to take up, everything from artist assistant to all the sort of shitty jobs that like we ask kind of young people to do. And I think like talking about labor, talking about money, it's usually not a favorite topic of dinner conversation, but that it is one that I think is like under theorized and under emphasized, and maybe that's just somewhere we could all kind of begin, is like look at like, okay, well, how are things paid for, who pays for what? I'm like endlessly fascinated currently by the fact that like universities across the world seem to be saying there's not enough money, but there's apparently a subscription to Anthropic or ChatGPT, like Oxford just released it, like they will now have it for everyone. And so, like we should always kind of press that. Like, what does it mean that there's always funding for this thing, but never enough funding for this thing? And yeah,
I think it's a really good illusion to demystify and extends to everything. I mean, as soon as austerity is always invoked and how there's a lack of money when it comes to social programs, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to education, but then when it comes to supplying bombs to Israel, for example, then it seems like there's an infinite supply. Then there's an endless amount of money to do these things. And it's a very interesting, but also what always strikes me is that it's impossible not to see it once you see it and
once you
once you
see,
recognize it. And then everything else starts to fall into place, like all of the media buzz, all of the debate culture stuff. You see what purpose it serves to distract from that very singular fact that there are billionaires that are profiting off of the steady capture of governments and social programs with the profit motive and with capitalist interest. And as soon as you're tuned into this, it becomes very difficult not to see it and to motivate actions for it, which is what I definitely recommend everybody do in whatever capacity you can, to be involved in whatever local or more broadly national or international organizations that are doing this kind of work, especially opposing billionaires, which seems like very the first level, but still, regardless, something that should happen. Um, is at least how I transform my nihilism into political action in ways that I can.
yeah, I think that we are, as a society, that we have been encouraged and propagandized to identify with billionaires and not with each other, so
Yeah.
there seems to like be like endless sort of understanding of like people who are pretty much ready to like, you know wreak havoc at any scale. When you were saying like endless resources for some things, when I was looking through the Frick Collections archives, like Rockefeller and Mellon were some of the original board members. This Rockefeller was responsible for the most violent, the most amount of violence against workers in U.S. history, the Colorado coalfield wars, which lasted over a year. And all of this is really, all of this sort of union busting was around wages. Like, how much should a worker get? And this is such a contest. This seems to be such a constant source of conflict. So like I'm reading the acquisition record. I'm reading like the sort of the sales catalog, like knowing and keeping this labor history in mind, which is another thing that I would encourage us to do, is like read the histories together, like what's being purchased, what's being authorized as it's happening together. So if you look at the sort of correspondence that some of the curators and the board members are doing around like what should they buy? Should they buy this particular painting? No one is asking for a discount. Like the price is not being haggled over. Like no one seems to worry about the price actually. Like the comments are like, I'm not an expert, but I would like to own it. So like let's buy it. The questions aren't like, are you sure we have enough money for it? Because it's already decided that it's worthy of acquisition and it's worthy of collection. So I think like that is what you can immediately see when someone says there's not enough money for this, when an institution says there's not enough money for this, but subscription to a large language model that no one asked for, like why not? I think that like you can kind of see that right away. And then secondarily, I always encourage people not to do free public relations for people who already have PR firms. So like billionaires, the corporations, like perhaps there's less understanding of their position, their, oh no, did I lose you for a second?
I think you're back now. So
Okay, okay.
less understanding of their.
Yeah, like I get very worried when someone immediately says like, oh, but like it's really important that they make a profit. I'm like, well, why don't we like, didn't they say they are the owners? Like they should worry about their own problems. We should let them worry about that, and we should fight for each other. We should like try to create like more understanding of each other, more understanding of, and like more kind of like connection with each other. Because I have noticed this thing where like instead of the target of like, or like instead of the sort of anger and aggression being directed to the very people who are enacting harm, it seems like sometimes it's dispersed to the people who we think we're closest to. And I worry about that kind of misdirection. I don't know if
Yeah,
that
but
has
it's
anything to do with
totally, yeah, but it's
that.
weaponizing so many different things, be it racism, be it xenophobia, be it anything like that. And to go to the title again, like the politics of collecting, you have billionaires and millionaires who are able to make a habit of collecting things, and then they're celebrated for it. This is a sign of the triumphs of capitalism and what anybody is open to. But if you're somebody without wealth who collects things, then you're pathologized. Then there's
You're a
something wrong
hoarder.
with you. Perhaps you're in need of
Yeah.
institutionalization for possessing too many things, when the same would never befall Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg for having too many things. So, like, the very ability to collect is not only contingent upon certain historical and material possibilities, but it's also dependent upon a logic of institutional pathologization and medicalization that
Yes.
contributes to the continued, um, you know, pathologization of certain people for participating in these acts, and while commending others, provided they have the right status and position and everything, and they aren't even giving back. They aren't like the old billionaires giving us like one library. Like, what are they doing?
Yeah. Well, I'm like, what is it? And the workers during the Carnegie kind of moment, they were like, you are not giving to us. We don't know who these are for. Like, this isn't for us because we work 12 to 18-hour shifts, you know? So it's like, I think even the notion of giving back, the notion of generosity, all of that should be like fundamentally ruptured because the philanthropy I mean, like, there's a line, I think Bloomberg at a speech for John Hopkins said something like he partakes in philanthropy because you can't spend it all and you can't take it with you when you die. But it's like, well, then why do you have it? Like, what is it that you mean? It almost seems like a hatred of the present to say like the workers of the present can't have this, we can't have this. It also seems like it's a paternalistic reorganization of society because they do not have the expertise actually. Like it would not be like a radical argument to argue like that after a process of de-skilling, the manager who doesn't do the work maybe doesn't know best. Like, so what does it even mean? Like, even in terms of like technological efficiency, whatever that means, like this kind of top-down model, not just of the corporation, but of society is how I think we could read the philanthropic model, which is how we can read the institutional frameworks of like, art collections and so forth. Like, is this the art of our society? Is this the art of our generation? I'm not sure because if it's sequestered to like the few people who can hold on to objects, that's just a different orientation, I think, of that framework.
Completely. And I mean, that seems like a great place to wrap up. Unless you have anything else, any other points or any other comments?
I am always worried that I didn't say something, and I will probably remember the thing that I didn't say. But yeah, I think if more people kind of work on projects around kind of material history and aesthetics, we might be able to like, I think there are people who are really working on like really important material history and like art history together. And I'm always kind of looking to those people. So I do think that like it has become less so a conversation around like the individual genius of like some artist. And I'm endlessly looking forward to kind of like what young students, how they're able to see something that like the scholar of who's been teaching on the topic for years insists. So those are the moments that I look forward to. So maybe I'll hear from some of such students, which would be a surprise and an excitement for me.
That sounds lovely. I really share that enthusiasm, and I think that it's really important to hear as many people's perspectives as possible because this is how we learn. But
Yes.
Professor Kim, that was a real honor of mine. Thank you so much for coming and chatting with me about your book. I hope that you're able to extract as much of this conversation from this conversation as I was, and that when you write your next book, you'll appear again.
Thank you so much for having me, David. It was so nice to be here, and it's such an honor because I am a huge, huge fan once again.
Perfect. Thank you so much.